What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to episode 24 of Reframing the Narrative. And we are super excited to have our guest this week, Michael, who I met and became friends with at Confluence 2025. It was amazing. And we had a really interesting and enlightening conversation, I think, for both of us, as I had to head out for the last day that I was volunteering there. And I thought, why not have an extension of that conversation here for our audience? Because I think they'd get a lot out of it. So I think that's probably the starting point for this week's podcast, is just to introduce you, Michael. Maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and we can just kick the conversation off from there.
Cool. Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. I've been eager to reconnect with any of the people that I got close to at Confluence because it seemed like everyone that you interacted with, you got close very quickly. So I'm happy to talk to you, even just as buddies, but I feel honored that you wanted to have a conversation with me so formally. Uh, I am I'm living in Florida currently, me and my wife. My identity would be I'm a child of God, a student of Jesus Christ. And to make money, I am a plumber. I have lived in a couple different states. I was in the Navy for a short period of time. And I'm definitely in the middle of a phase of life where I'm having a lot of paradigms broken and perspectives changing. And it's a very humbling process. And man, you saw me at the climax of that at Confluence because everywhere you looked, it was something that was challenging the belief systems that we were raised on. So I'm excited to just be vulnerable about that experience and honestly how difficult it can be to stay positive and continue through that search for truth.
It really can be disheartening. That's one thing that we've covered extensively here. Basically, with that knowledge that you have, or even if it's a track that you're on and you think it's knowledge, it's just a trajectory. You're not even sure and you're questioning everything. What do you do with it? How do you spend your your psychic energy? How do you pay your attention? We constantly stress that. Pay your attention, pay money, monetarily, everything like that. Where does your energy go? But if we could backtrack just a little bit, how did you end up at Confluence, Michael? Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's how you and PJ met.
Yeah, so I that was my first Confluence, and my wife had been to one of their previous events and loved it. And throughout our relationship, she had just continued to mention not only Confluence, but the friends that she had made those previous years. So when they reached out to her offering her to be a part of the event, um, all I heard was, "Oh, free ticket to a music festival? Sign me up, count me in." And it ended up being a lot more than that, but we packed up everything into a travel trailer on the back of my truck and drove from Florida out to Texas, and it was uh it was life-changing, and it felt kind of like a climax in this experience that I've been having recently over the past year of just, like I said, paradigms changing and shattering, and myself opening more and more to that humbling experience of like, okay, I might have been wrong about this and that, and oh, I'm wrong again and again. And it was, yeah, Confluence was this pinnacle of just our releasing and letting go and being like, oh man, yeah, I don't know, and it's okay. And for the first time, actually, not only feeling happy and okay in that not knowing, but almost like a level of empowerment in stepping into that.
Absolutely. And, I enjoyed myself so much that Jake and I have already talked about being there next year to volunteer and spending more time, especially coming from his neck of the left coast. I know it'll be worth him to stay longer for that trip. But one of the things that really struck me about the many conversations we had, Michael, was just how open you were to hearing other perspectives. And you and I, towards the end there, had exchanged our stories of how we came to our current faith. And, I shared with you one of the big moments in my truth journey that made me really go, oh, wow. So there's no doubt that we are created and that the world around us is evidence of that. And I think my story was not unique in the sense that once you get a grasp, or at least for me personally, I got a grasp of the shape of the world and kind of the system we live in, there was no denying it. And that's where you and I started this really fruitful conversation. And I think that you had even alluded to that there were certain things that you were pretty sure were lies. NASA is not trustworthy in some of those aspects. And since then, I'm not sure how much time you've spent thinking about some of the topics we talked about, but maybe I'll just tee it up for you. What of the conversation we had, what really resonated with you, or where's your head at in terms of this concept that maybe what we were told about our world and everything around us was not what it turned out to be. What are your thoughts there? And I know that you're maybe on the fence, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. We had a really good conversation about that, but that might be a good starting point for keeping this conversation going.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have considered myself still very much a glober when I came into Confluence. It's funny, my wife and I were even, I don't know what spurred it, but on the way into the ranch coming through Bandera, for some reason, I started a conversation about like, come on, you can't be this foolish to believe this stuff. And then by the time I was having a conversation with you, I had already been so humbled about so many of my beliefs that I was just very open to the idea, and that's kind of where I'm at now. I did watch. I don't even know how much of it, at least maybe an hour or two of that documentary you sent me. Um, and I have shifted from a pretty confident glober to very open to the possibility that it might not only not be a globe, but it could be a disk in a void. It could be an infinite horizontal plane, the sky and our atmosphere and all the stars in the sky and our own sun and our relation to our own solar system. It's opened up completely. Um, which, yeah, like I said, it can be frustrating and kind of, I mean, I guess that's the nature of having these paradigm shatters is your system fights. Your everything down to your nervous system tells you to hold on to that security that you felt in your prior beliefs. And I think that's part of our human nature is we so badly want to be able to say that we have things figured out, whether for ourselves or for the people around, for our kids. We want to be able to say like, no, this is gravity does this, and that's where we are in space, and this is how fast we're moving through that infinite expanding vacuum. We want to be able to say that, and we cling on to that so bad. But yeah, it's now I'm in a place of much more openness, and it's the cool thing is it returns you to this like childlike state of being able to look up into the sky, and you look with a little bit, or personally I look with a little bit more wonder and awe now.
Absolutely. And that actually, from a faith perspective, for me, made me even that much more appreciative of the world that God created for us. That when you really start to recalibrate how you see this world, that you see that it's one big time clock and everything is working in sync with each other. And you could even lending to Jake's recent experience being in Prague and seeing the clock in the main town square, alluding to a lot of that in fact the celestial beings are moving in a very predictable pattern around us, and that everything was just built in total sync with each other. Really, just to me, when that started computing, it was like, wow, not only was everything created, but it was created so intelligently and beautifully. Just to me, it deepens my faith. But you know, there's a number of things you have to come to grips with along that path, and I'm sure that I think one of the things we talked about was moon landings. I think you're probably on our general train of thought that they were completely staged and phony and all that. And we actually did an episode many episodes back now, landing on a hoax, where we talked about some of the really obvious tells for the moon landing. And I think for a lot of people, once they realize that we in fact didn't go to the moon, I think that's really the starting point for people saying, okay, so what else have they lied to us about? And then you take it to that next step about NASA green screen fakery, and some of the evidence people have shown time and time over in videos of, pulling on harnesses or bubbles, where bubbles shouldn't exist in the infinite vacuum of space. There's some of these things where you just have to ask, well, if they are in space, then why do they have to go through these lengths to show us otherwise? So that's I think one of the big beginnings of discovery. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, Michael. What are the things in your journey that you're still trying to wrap your head around? I'm sure that you've progressed. Sounds like, you've watched some of these videos and you're starting to be a lot more open to it. But where are the points where you struggle, or where you're really trying to think of, okay, so if what I've been told is not true, or parts of it aren't true, then how does this work, or how does that work? What are the things you're still kind of working through?
So this might be just the stage that I'm at, where I'm now that I've seen how many things could be incorrect about what I've been told. I'm at this place of being very hesitant. I'm very cautious as far as I mean, that's something, a trend I was noticing in myself, was I would have these paradigm shifts, or a perspective changing moment, and then my nature would be to want to, okay, that's a lie, but then this is the truth over here. I would want to snap back into, like, okay, that's the lie, but then I have the other, it's this over here instead. Um, and I'm trying my best to avoid that for my own benefit, not to just sink back into another belief system just because my one got broken down. Specifically with the flat earth idea, I have come to the place where, like I said, I'm very open to not only that it's not a globe, but it could be a number of things, including a donut that is constantly swirling in and out of itself in a way that we would never be able to perceive. But one of the things that was a hang up for me, especially as a believer in Christ, was the claim that the globe model, or the globe theory, was designed to make us feel smaller and like less connected to God, that there's this infinite, space outside of our planet, that and God is somewhere far, far out there, or not there. And I never felt that. I feel like I was able to rationalize in my head, like, yeah, there can be these solar systems, and this could be the way that it's set up, and still feel the closeness to God. But like I said before, it's given me an opportunity to see things a little bit more, like, with an appreciation for the mystery. And it's not about how close he is physically or any of that. What does make sense, and it came from that documentary you sent me, was this idea of the globe Earth makes it so much easier to then transition into how the Earth was formed, how our solar system was formed, the Big Bang, and it's all these daisy chain of theories that comes from the globe Earth that falls apart when it's like, all right, if that's not the case, then all those other things all those other theories fall apart. So that made a lot of sense as far as why, there would be any benefit to the puppeteers or the powers that be to have this globe lie, But hey, anytime they're taking us away from the truth, they're winning in some small or big way.
Absolutely. Yeah. To quote our recent guest, Ernest Hancock, the truth is not lies, right? So we can definitely spot when they're lying to us in some fashion. And I think that's what's unique about the community of people like those who go to a Confluence is that we know that we've been lied to. We know that there's other truths out there, and we're all working in our own ways to try to discover what those truths are. And I would be very wary of anyone who says they know for sure. For example, like, so what if we're not on a globe, then what is it? Well, I don't know. How would I ever know? I know that there's certain aspects that have been documented throughout time. For example, the North Pole, there used to be maps that showed the 4 islands and Rupus Nigre in the middle, the Black Rock. There's accounts of people encountering the whirlpool and everything that's happening up there. I have to believe there's some truth to that. Why would they have put that on various maps and sailors from the 1500s write their accounts of everything that happened up there? As an extension of that, why are we not allowed to go up near the North Pole on our own? These are questions where I think enough of those pieces together fit together and tell a story where I can say somewhat confidently, well, I'm pretty sure that somewhere up north there's probably 4 islands and a big magnetic mountain because it's been written about. There's been pictures drawn of it. Why would they have those out there otherwise? Beyond that, though, I don't really know. I like to point to Rob Skiba. He came up with a really interesting schematic of what our actual reality might look like, but it was also his best guess. I kind of look at it as when I pass on to the next life, maybe God will show me and it'll be really cool. And it'll be like, man, I already knew you were brilliant, but wow, that was really cool what you put together. I wish I had seen that before. And
Yeah.
so I think in all of this, we have to, as you said, be really humble that there's some things we'll never know, and that's fine. But we definitely know truth is not lies, right? And that's the starting point. And you just have to be open that sometimes you have to let go of certain notions, and you pegged it perfectly there, Michael. It's like if you go straight to, well, I know for sure what the answer is, then you're setting yourself up for misrepresenting something to someone else who might be curious, but also disappointment when you discover you were wrong on that as well. And that's okay. I think it's all a path of discovery, and there's the more that I know, the less I really understand, and the less I cling to ideas really tightly because there's just no way of knowing certain things. But I would say another thing is gravity is a complete hoax, and there's gravity is whatever people say it needs to be to plug in the equations and make the math work. But I digress. Jake, what are your thoughts on that? We made Michael talk a lot here, and you've been patiently quiet. Let me let you put some thoughts in there.
Thanks, PJ, and really interesting conversation so far with Michael. I'm really enjoying this and kind of feeling a sense of deja vu as he's experiencing some of the feelings and questions that a lot of us all do as we go through a process of kind of discovering things, and not necessarily the truth, but what we believe is closer to how things may be, or at least, as PJ was saying, quoting Ernie, that we know what we can disregard to the best of our knowledge as the truth or as the facts, and then we don't have the burden of solving exactly what the truth is. We just have to be equipped with that inquisitiveness, curiosity, and discernment to question it, and that leads to really wonderful places. And I really enjoy that Michael is saying that it makes him feel a bit more childlike in that wonderment that he has towards the universe, because that's not always the case. A lot of times we might feel a little, as they say, black-pilled, a little despair, a little hopelessness. And I don't want to contribute to anyone getting black-pilled either, so that's extra good. So that's really wonderful to hear. And I think along those lines, one example would be like we've covered on this podcast is the way people get sick or the nature of illness or dis-ease. And we've been told it's because of these foreign invaders that are microscopic and you can't see, and you have to put in a petri dish and culture with monkey kidney cells and bovine growth hormone, which is basically just they stick a needle in a calf embryo. um, so, and then that's the only time you can see it. Well, if we're coughing 10 billion particles at a time, we should just be able to hold something up and say cough in this handkerchief, and then take the handkerchief and centrifuge the liquid that comes off of that and say, well, we didn't get 10 billion viruses, we only got 8 billion, and then go and take a look at that. But they can't do that. So we can question the nature of illness and that it doesn't come from germs, but we don't have to be the ones. We don't have to have the onus on us as the people questioning that reality to solve, kind of like solving a crime. I know that I had an alibi. I don't have to solve the crime if I know it didn't go down this way. And that kind of leads to the idea of if you allow yourself, you give yourself the permission to not know everything, like Michael was saying, that allows you to explore more things. And I love that quest. And that's the kind of quest that I think we're all on here. And then another thing that you were mentioning that we fall into is the trap of, you were saying, Michael, that if you're questioning one thing, you're easily kind of bounce back to something that you could have assurance about. And that's really that dualistic, the binary nature of everything that we've been taught. If it's not black, it's white. If it's not a virus, then what could it be? It's got to be something, right? There has to be an it there. But if you allow yourself the permission to just question, then maybe you'll end up going in a direction that you never explored before, including the nature, let's say, of those researching human health. Well, maybe they'll give up the whole particle-based and material-based paradigm, and then they'll go into an energetic paradigm. And I think that can lead into what you were saying, like about the nature of the world and the universe, perhaps even being a toroid or a donut, right? So we can maybe leave that whole particle materialistic paradigm aside, if not behind, and then move on to other explanations or quests. So I've said enough for now.
Yeah, moving on
What do you think about that?
from that particle-based worldview into the energetic one, I feel like that is a big part of this great awakening that's taking place in the earth right now. It's I think that's a part of it, is the shift from this molecule particle based worldview into energetic, harder to understand currently concepts, but I think that's part of the awakening that we're seeing on like a grand scale around the world.
Yeah, totally agreed. And even Tesla, if it truly was his quote, one of his famous quotes is that if you want to understand the world, it's energy, frequency, vibration. These are all things that on some level I think we know intuitively are true, but how that works, my gut tells me that they're probably a lot easier to understand if we just knew the right key to open the right door. Where things, when you really think about it, where things get really complicated is when you have someone like Einstein who comes forward and starts positing that, number one, you have to understand the world through a bunch of equations no one can understand, and then come up with an explanation for why the Michelson-Morley experiment failed or Airy's failure failed. Some of these famous experiments from the late 1800s, early 1900s, where he says, well, those experiments didn't have the expected results because you can't ever really measure motion because everything is moving, really, really moving the goalpost. to say, well, you can't really understand it because everyone's moving. It's an easy way to understand relativity that most people, they think E equals mc squared, and that's sort of what they were taught as the genius equation, but they don't really understand what that means. And a simple analogy is, well, if you say that you were sitting on a sidewalk and a car went by you, relativity says, well, you can't really measure how fast that car was going because you were moving while the car was moving, and it's all relative to where you are and your position in the universe. And that's where all these crazy equations are made. And it's like, well, what about Occam's razor that says there has to be a simpler explanation? Maybe you were actually standing still and that car was actually going by at a certain rate. But that's where scientism comes up with all these complexities, and a lot of people give away their power and their consent to so-called authorities who understand all these complexities, but maybe they never needed to be that complex in the first place.
And if we go back into the history of the globe, let's say a hypothesis, speaking of authority, we see the authorities and, people were treated as heretics if they didn't take a certain position because the globe became the paradigm. And why would authorities invest so much in a certain paradigm or certain model? I do think it's really, I've come along the same journey in a way. And again, it's really heartening to hear Michael say that he's never felt insignificant. Like we're taught Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, right?
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. In all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves.
It's a beautiful poem. It's kind of elegant and magical, and it's full of wonderment in some ways, but then the overall takeaway is, wow, we're just such a tiny little speck. We're just like a gnat on a world-size dog's hairy butt. And but then if you do feel like this was created for a reason and for us, then we really are God's chosen people, every single person here, and we are special. And it's kind of hard to figure out the purpose of all this at this time, but there's got to be a purpose, right?
Amen. Yeah. And about being okay with not knowing, I think that's the key to avoiding the black pill. And I don't know, I've heard the term clear pill used, which I like. But I have to give credit to my wife. I mean, be so properly, she lived in that space, and she helped me understand when I would try to snap back, I would have, my belief system questioned and challenged, and I would try and snap back to, all right, well, if it's not this, then it's that. And she has taught me so the importance of being okay. It's just so simply being okay with not knowing.
And that's the natural reaction from a lot of people when you start questioning some of these belief systems. And it actually happened in a chat that Jake and I are both a part of. So Agent 131711, holla, giving him another shout out in this particular episode. But he started a chat for his subscribers, and there was a pretty lengthy discussion amongst the subscribers about the shape of the Earth. And there was some people who are still on the baller Earth camp who were saying, well, then explain this to me, explain that to me, explain this to me, explain that to me. And to some degree, that's fair. I think that with any belief that you have, you should be able to have some form of defense of why you think that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be able to explain everything. That's, I think, the responsibility of anyone in their research. But certain things, I think, are self-evident. And one of my favorite examples is, okay, so if we're on a spinning ball in an infinite vacuum, how is it that that infinite vacuum hasn't sucked all our atmosphere out? And, the common response is, well, gravity. Well, explain to me how that works. And it's like, well, gravity. Ask Neil deGrasse Tyson, what is gravity? And he'll say, I have no idea. He's on record saying that. So there's some of these things, or the higher you go up, the horizon always comes to your eye level, no matter how high you go up. Whereas if we lived on a big sphere of some kind, eventually you're going to see that horizon kind of curve over. You're going to have to look over to see over the horizon, whereas, we see the horizon come to eye level. There's some of these things that are very easy for me to throw out there. It's like, well, certainly doesn't look like we're on a rounded sphere, and the rest of it, I think, as we talked about, we're all figuring out little by little. But that doesn't mean that I have to be able to explain the entirety of God's creation, because there's no way that I'd ever know. So I think, back to that point of, do we have to snap back to things that we say that we know for sure? I don't think so. And that's back to Ernie's quote of, I know the truth is not lies.
And humility being such a core concept in that, like, we got to remain humble. That's, the thing that we have to embody in that space of being okay not knowing.
Just maintaining that sense of wonderment and also trusting in the higher power, because maybe that's the whole point, is that there is mystery to it. And maybe this plane of existence, not just the shape being a plane, which I'm not sure of either, this plane of existence is meant to be kind of a mysterious realm where we don't have all the answers, but maybe karmically we are meant to work things out. I mean, just looking at the way generations kind of hold on to certain things. I don't really believe in epigenetics. I think people just pass things on, and then if you become aware of something going on in your family, like a history of alcoholism or tendency to blow up or run away from problems or something like that, then you should address it. That's just making progress.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think this nature that we have now in our modern world of wanting to claim, either for ourselves or others, that we have everything figured out, has led to it's such a bad state when we try to walk into the, questioning what is God and figuring out our, what our relationship is with the creator. Because when people reach the end of the line of, we can ask so many questions and we can figure out some basic stuff like, yeah, I do think the grass is green and I think water is wet. There's some basic ones that I'd like to say that I believe are true. But we've become so accustomed to this idea that if we don't have it figured out, we can figure it out. And that falls so short when you're trying to study something like the Bible or the nature of our, omnipotent creator. Before I even stepped into this world of like really being open to not knowing, I used to have this struggle of, I would read my Bible or I would listen to pastors and, theological conversations. And it's like, I always say this to people, there's no questions you can't ask, and I think that's unfortunately has been the experience of a lot of, especially like Western Protestants, where, and I'm sure it might be a condition of a number of world religions, where they go to their elders and unfortunately they receive that answer of, oh, you don't ask that. And I don't think that's the case ever. I think we can ask every question and not feel like we're being, flippant or disobedient or blasphemous in asking any question and every question. But we have to be okay. Sometimes we'll know, sometimes it'll just be left open-ended, and being okay with the answer being you can't know that right now. In the same way that a child, how many people have experienced this, whether they have kids or they've seen it, where a kid goes to their parent and they say, "Yeah, why is this?" And the parent gives them an answer, and then they go, "Yeah, but why? But why?" And you just go further and further. And at a certain point, the parent just has to look in the kid's eyes and say, to themselves, "Okay, I love this person so much and I want to give them the answers." And what comes out of their mouth is, "You just can't, even if I laid this out for you on a platter right now, you can't understand it. This is not for you to know right now." And that has been huge for me in, building my personal relationship with Christ and the creator. Is there's no questions that I can't ask, but I might get to the end of a line of questioning at some points, and the result might be, that's not for you to know right now. And like I said, our worldview today of having everything figured out does such a disservice when we're in that pursuit.
Yeah, totally agreed. And referencing scientism and the answers we've been given to certain aspects of our reality, it's a really important point you're raising there, that when we give over to authorities and their explanations, it takes away our ability to question and wonder and understand, because we're kind of taking that spoon-fed version of the reality they painted for us. And when I started grasping some of these things about the shape of the world, and I started that same place, that documentary I shared with you. And for our listeners, I'll just say that for me, one of the fundamental ones was called "What on Earth Happened" by Iwaranon. And that's what really slow walked me into changing my mind, that maybe I didn't have it all figured out, and maybe these people talking about the shape being different weren't as crazy as I thought they were. But once I came to grips with that, it's like, well, then you start looking at, well, when did evolution come about? And when did the idea of dinosaurs come about? And when did the idea of Big Bang come about? It's kind of curious that they all came out in the same general time frame in our history, and they all happen to be proposed by Freemasons and their affiliates. You start getting this sense of, maybe there is this story they wanted woven in our heads to take away our power to not understand our true position in creation, and to just say, well, they're experts and they must understand because this math is too complicated for me. But even then, humans are so resilient and so smart and curious that there were all these experiments that happened that showed that some of these things just simply couldn't be true. And I referenced the Michelson-Morley experiment, or, a really simple one to understand is the Bedford Level experiment, where in a certain canal in England, they set up flag markers and boats, and they did measurements, and they showed without the shadow of a doubt that whole canal was level. There was no curvature to it whatsoever. And enough of these grassroots experiments happened where they had to put this actor out on stage named Einstein and have him create even more complexity that no one could understand, to where it's like, well, okay, the experts know the experts must be right, because I can't figure this out, what they're talking about, right? But I think we're in this next phase of human understanding, and a lot of that kicked off with the scamdemic in 2020, where people started going, wow, they're really over the top in this narrative they're pushing. And, if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about? And I feel like we're in that next level of people kind of breaking down the paradigms and saying, okay, so what is reality? What is the truth? And they're going to have to come up with something really big and devious to get people back into another state of confusion. And, well, it is 2025, as we talked about in last week's episode. It's the golden age year. So maybe we saw a few of those hints of that happening this past weekend. But who knows? Who knows what's to come? But I think that, humans inherently are curious and intuitive, and we will figure this out. And I think we're all collectively figuring it out.
Yeah, so I think it's been a lot of kumbaya so far. We're all kind of agreeing. We're all sort of on the same trajectory here. Maybe PJ and I have been delving into this a little longer than Michael has, but what kind of questions do remain for you about the nature of the universe, the world, our existence and that sort of thing. And not to set up a debate or anything, but I'm just curious about like, are there any questions remaining for you, or are you sold on it? Because again, I don't really like labels, and I'm definitely not a conspiracy theorist. That's obviously something that when the Warren Commission came out with the Warren Report and the Magic Bullet, anybody that didn't agree with that, the CIA coined the phrase conspiracy theorist and hit hard with that. And I reject that because that tends to turn people's minds off.
This is our third issue this year. Conspiracy theory.
He sends them out.
Hey, look, I feel kind of naked back here. Could we get out of here?
Please don't tell me you're naked back there.
If it's kind of like using the term denier, whether you're talking about certain events of history or hoaxes like climate change.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, what kind of questions remain for you, or what paths do you look forward to exploring?
For the sake of my mental health, I started asking the question, what does it change if this is true? At least in my actual life. And unfortunately, a lot of it can just, once I've stepped into this being okay with not knowing and not having to replace my belief systems with another belief system, it does actually, that's part of the empowerment, is it allows me to step back and say, oh, I don't know what's going on with Antarctica, but I actually can't find out for myself by threat of being shot out of the sky. The idea that there is more out there, I mean, God put an adventurous spirit in our hearts. And he gave us this nature to want to explore and ask questions, and it's such an assault against our freedom to say that we can't go see something like Antarctica. Another one that has really made me curious recently is the Devil's Little Season concept, and it seems to make almost a little too much sense. But again, it's another one that goes, well, and maybe you could answer this for me, like what does that change about how I live my life, and the way that all of it being one of my biggest priorities in life is being as good of a student as I can. And that even saying that out loud, it's like, I don't know how humble that is, because I guess I just have to specify, I want to be a good student, not because I want others to look at me and say, what a good student he is, but I want I want to be close to the Father. And I feel that study and being, a student and a grasshopper is the way to do that. So it's tough, man. It's really tough to not just keep asking the questions and being like, well, what is up with Antarctica? And, what is this missing time period, and all these unexplainable parts of our history that they've just put little labels on to pacify people, and we just go on our way. That when we were talking at Confluence and you used that phrase, Devil's Little Season, I had never even heard that phrase before. But when you said that, I got goosebumps all over my body. And it's, sometimes their hair stands up, sometimes you get goosebumps, but then there's like the type of goosebumps you get when you listen to a beautiful song that just touches you somewhere deep. And I could be wrong, but that I'm really practicing how to hear from God. I'm really trying to learn how to, in this loud, attention grabbing world, I've been trying to quiet myself and listen and hear for God, wherever he wants to point me, whatever he wants my attention to be focused on. And that's been an interesting one, where it seems to be when someone speaks truth, someone speaks a deep truth, whether I have heard it or understand it or not, my body just is covered in these just rich goosebumps. It's an amazing feeling. It feels really good. And that happened when you just said that phrase, Devil's Little Season, and I immediately knew what you were talking about. even though I had never been introduced to that concept before, and I found that really powerful and meaningful.
Yeah, and there is so technically it's called Satan's Little Season. That's what it's been coined in the community of content creators that I follow. But I feel like it is an extension of, okay, you figured out the shape of the earth, or at least the truths that we can know, and obviously there's much more to understand. And then you start putting these pieces together of all the other deceptions. And I think a lot of people get to a point where they do get that temptation of getting into the black pill territory where it's like, well, everything's a lie, everything's BS, and what's the point? For me, I thought I had sort of reached the end of all the rabbit holes, and then this little season idea came about, or really started gaining traction. The idea that there was a millennial reign, and that actually is what was labeled by the controllers as the quote unquote dark ages. That is where you really start putting all these pieces together, and it makes so much sense that it's like that grand unifying theory. But to your question, Michael, what impact does that have to anyone's life? And I would say for someone who lived their entire life in the 1900s, probably not a lot, except, there was just this conscripted world that was made for us, and to live in this system, the what I call the beast system, and others do as well. But for those people, probably it didn't make a big difference. But I think we're in a different age now, and I don't know when the next or the next theater act will take place, but I have a feeling it's not that far off in our horizons. And where I think that does matter, and I alluded to this a little bit in the first video that I had made for the Central Texas Rabbit Hole, but I'm really just borrowing from other people who have put some of these pieces together. And if we are in that little season where we all have our opportunity to choose light or darkness, that eventually there will be this push to unify the world into the Gog and Magog referred to in Revelation, to ultimately get on the wrong side, to go fight against the saints in the camp of the saints. And there could be something that happened in our lifetime where there's some grand deception. A lot of people think it could be Project Bluebeam, or the big alien card that they've been holding off for a while, where a lot of things happen in the sky, where there's holographic illusions, and we're all led to go fight that big force that's supposedly threatening humanity. But what if that force is actually the camp of the saints or New Jerusalem, and it's been obscured and masked by the controllers, and people are convinced, go fight that? Well, then now suddenly you're on the wrong side of history, and that's where it could matter. Now, if none of that plays out in our lifetimes, then it's more of a philosophical debate. What eschatology was right, what was actually true. But I tend to think that even what we know in the quote unquote truther community is that country in the Middle East is not the one from the Bible, and what they're doing behind the scenes and taking land and killing people is not in the name of God. And I think that has real life impact as well. So there's a lot of dimensions to this discussion, but for me, I just think that us being in the little season makes too much sense. But I do reserve the right to change my mind if other evidence comes out. And I have a limited understanding of things, and that's where I think Jake and I are always talking about having discernment. Whatever comes next in the future, just you're going to have to apply that discernment, and it might be really, really difficult as things amp up with different types of AI that exist and different holographic imagery. We're really going to have to say, what is the intention of what we're being shown? What is it asking me to do? Are we now unifying as a world against something? Are we somehow giving away our power? That's where we really have to look at everything through that lens of, yeah, but what's the intended outcome here?
I think it's pretty undeniable, no matter where you look, whether it's the truther community or the politicians who have spent, very little time actually pursuing real truth. It seems like everyone is having the conversation that we're reaching a boiling point, that unlike anything we've ever seen in our recorded history, at least the recorded history that's been handed to us. But there's so much truth in what you're saying, man. Because, I like what you said, while I reserve the right to change my position, I do strongly believe that there is a spiritual war taking place on this plane, whatever this three-dimensional plane that we live on. There's a real war taking place, and unfortunately, the dark seems to be taking it a lot more seriously than most of the people who align with the light.
It's like that line in the Terminator,
That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
It's like while we're here and we're debating the shape of the earth or red versus blue or does Iran have nukes or something like that, they're out there multi-generationally. They've got their plan and they got people in position that are working to move that agenda forward. And their favorite trick is to keep us divided. That's so easy, divided and distracted. Yeah. Fat, dumb, and distracted.
Yeah, and it's crazy what's happening in the world right now as we sit and have this conversation. Yeah, I'm grateful that I've reached the point in my development that stimulus, I'm able to go to a place of gratitude. I look on the news and I see it seems like Iran and Israel are basically at full open war now, and we're probably not far behind in supporting Israel and all of the implications of those things. But yeah, I'm so grateful that the thing that first comes to me is like, you know what? When I get home from work today, I'm going to really tell my wife how much I appreciate her and love her. And I'm going to enjoy just that evening of having dinner with her because, now the reality is so apparent and in front of our faces that no, tomorrow is not promised. On that, uh, on that train of thought, as far as the spiritual warfare goes, and you asked the question, what's really been piquing my interest and where the questions have been, I've been for a little while researching. I don't know if you guys know Dr. Michael S. Heiser. He's an Old Testament scholar who, one of many, has done a lot of work in bringing us more accurate translations of Old Testament. And, that leads into the incredibly fun story of, oh yeah, there were giants and all the implications that go along with that and where they came from and the fact that those entities might still be playing a big role in the turmoil and the illness that we're seeing take over the planet. And then that's led me into, I don't know how much you guys have listened to any of these satanic ritual abuse survivors and their stories. And now they're bringing out the tools that they're showing us their game plans that the darkness has been using for hundreds, if not thousands of years to keep themselves in power. And that's something that's really been piquing my interest recently. Because I mean, what's more exciting than that? Giants are real, yeah, and we can fight them, with our meager bodies, all with Christ. Yeah, that's something I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I mean, I couldn't say how many Nephilim are left in the world, and if there are any hiding out somewhere, there's every reason to believe that they're afraid of us, just because we have many accounts of the Old Testament, and even the Philistines, I think, were probably Nephilim, and there's different accounts in those books of the Israelites going in and being as grasshoppers to these huge people, but still finding a way to defeat them. Well, not the way to defeat them. And of course, those who were vanquished by the flood or other means are here in a spiritual realm doing war with us all the time, as you alluded to. So yeah, and a big tip of the hat to Paul Stobbs and Understanding Conspiracy for all the work that he did with comparing the Nephilim to clowns and really tying that back into the clown culture that's been pushed on us. Probably not an accident. I highly recommend his book too, The Nephilim Look Like Clowns. It's a good read, and it really ties another aspect of our reality together. Just to get back to the little season idea, and this is, I've now turned into wild speculation mode because there's no way for me to know, but I do follow a lot of these channels that talk about little season type of topics, and there's Leaving Babylon, there's Understanding Conspiracy, Jason Jack. Those are some JT follows JC. Those are all good content creators who explore different aspects here. But one of those podcasts I watched in the last year had speculated that perhaps part of what they're holding back in Antarctica for the big play is the Nephilim horde. Maybe, maybe they let them loose as part of the chaos that ensues to get us as one united world force fighting against the quote unquote bad guys. I mean, who knows? But I think, yeah, the Book of Enoch was certainly taken out of the canon for a reason because it explains too much. And even going back to the shape of the earth and the path of the sun, I think it adds another dimension for those of us who can't 100% account for its motions and its patterns. But yeah, that's a really good point about Nephilim and its history and where it might be today. Jake, what are your thoughts there?
I just have one thought. If the Nephilim are clowns and they're going to be released from the nether worlds or, extra terra, I sure hope they're on giant unicycles. That's all I can say.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
So
I don't know if you're familiar with Nephilim Death Squad, but those guys are, they're like, they make a point of pronouncing it we're, for the sake of the show, we know it's supposed to be Nephilim, but we're from New York and New Jersey. We're just going to go with Nephilim. And anyway, they're called Nephilim Death Squad, and they've got a really good podcast. They cover some of these topics, and they're putting together a Bohemian Grove. So shout out to them, and definitely worth looking into their take on things as well, because they're just like a couple guys from the Northeast who, have a similar take on past history and there being giants, and they cover a whole bunch of other stuff, including satanic ritual abuse and other conspiracy type stuff, but definitely worth looking into. But yeah, I'm looking forward to those unicycles. That'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm gonna need the transcripts from this conversation because there is so much that you guys have referenced that I'm eager to dive into. I don't know if you guys have ever come across Laura Sanger, but she's done some cool work in connecting dots with the Nephilim. My theory about that, I love what you said. Let's step into the speculation zone. That's where we're existing right now. So, and this ties into the satanic ritual abuse. There's this concept that the Nephilim, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that demons are commonly misconstrued as the fallen angels. And I've come to understand that it might be more accurate to say that the Nephilim are actually, the demons are actually the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. And through these accounts of satanic ritual abuse, I saw this trend of what I was hearing about the Nephilim and how they operated and where they came from, and then what the satanic ritual abuse survivors and the family bloodlines that they were coming from, the practices that they were taking part in, very clearly has an objective. And what it seems to be, at least in part, along with many other dark things, is creating host bodies for these bodiless Nephilim spirits. These people will be very specifically selected because of their bloodlines. This is part of that work I was talking about. Like they're taking this war very seriously, and they're keeping it very quiet, obviously, for their own benefit and their own advantage. But through the selection of bloodlines, through the selective breeding therein, and then the abuse that these individuals go through, the ritualistic abuse that involves drugs and sexual abuse from, I'm sure, infancy. I mean, even the stage of conception, I'm sure those things are taking place at the moment of conception for these poor souls. And it seems to be that that's what's taking place, is they're creating these split psyche host bodies that these Nephilim spirits can then use as a vessel to operate in this world. Because apparently being without a body is torturous to them.
They're in the dry places. Absolutely. I mean, those are referred to in the New Testament as well when demons are cast out, that they're in a place where, there's a lot of discomfort and who knows. I mean, again, this is just me speculating, but definitely, yeah, they're living in the dry places. And that's another tip back to Paul Stobbs. He made that connection to when people do something like DMT and they're seeing these jesters and they think they're their friends and imparting wisdom, but in fact, those are those disembodied spirits that are trying to mislead people and perhaps even take them over and live in their bodies for a little while because they have nowhere else to go. So those jesters are definitely not your friends. I'm not that I'm suggesting you go there in the first place, but a lot of people have this illusion that they gain some great insight or wisdom getting on DMT or ayahuasca, name your poison, but I think they take you to the same place. And just to take things a step further, you're talking about, essentially you were referring to an MK Ultra slash satanic abuse. And I wonder too if some of these accounts, the ones that are true, I know there's a lot of misinformation out there leading to the alien agenda, but if there really are underground bases and there are some sort of weird hybrid creatures like the Greys, for example, that we've heard all these stories about, if any of those have truth or merit, I wonder if that is sort of an ongoing set of experimentations to create bodies for the disembodied spirits. I hold that as a realm of possibility. I can't say for sure, but of course, fracturing people's psyches through some of these MK Ultra 3-letter agency techniques, I think is definitely one way and could be part of a bigger picture. And even taking that a step further, the Agent 131711 has done some great work recently on looking at voice to skull technology and how that's transmitting into people's minds and giving them different visual and audio sensations. And when I read this, and it's a great series, I highly recommend it. One of my reactions is, so how does this tie into the spiritual world? I don't think those things are disconnected. And I just wonder if there's some connection between the dark arm of the Black Ops and some sort of satanic agenda somehow tied to Nephilim. I'm sure if we got out our big bulletin board and started doing the strings and the push pins, somehow those things would connect. But it's just really interesting to think about that, how some of these things could relate.
I think on a societal level and a worldwide level, we see it's not just the generational families, and it's not just those people who have been trafficked or even conceived, as Michael mentioned, conceived in rituals, and then brought up maybe even without an identity to be whatever, whether they're slaves or whether they're patsies that are used at some point in very
Assassins.
public. Yeah, exactly. Or things like what we hear from Kathy O'Brien, presidential sex slaves or kittens or whatever, what have you. But on a societal level, we're subject to a lot of that kind of ritual abuse, and it might be a little more of the mild kind, but we do find, we had a whole podcast on cognitive dissonance, and that's kind of a way of your mind just like splitting up and not being able to hold two truths at the same time, and just splitting up over that. And that's a defense mechanism, compartmentalizing different traumas, so as to protect the ego, essentially. And that's why we're so easily divided as well. And it's not super relevant to what we're talking about, the shape of the earth, but it begins with males in a lot of societies with circumcision, and that is a ritual abuse. And I'm planning a massive series on that. So just one of these days when I get the time, I'm making notes. But that's just how can society end up accepting and perpetuating that and encouraging it, because it's perpetuated because it's done over and over and over. There was actually a doctor who agreed and parents that agreed to have their child put into an MRI before it was done and then afterwards, and the child's brainwaves were never the same ever for their entire life. So, I mean, we're doing that on a societal level in the West and, of course, other cultures. But that's just an example, not to get too sidetracked with that. And then we're even things like horror movies, we're subjecting ourselves to these things and normalizing trauma, and we have an inevitable response to these things, and it plays out in society on all sorts of levels. So I think they've mastered that paradigm of making victims and getting them to conform to whatever use they have of them, and they've learned from that. And maybe just even the way our schools have been modeled as well, they've learned from that. So it's all kind of like maybe a more of a kindergarten level on a societal level, and it's not as intense, but it does exist. So that's the point I want to make on that.
Yeah, everything from the industrial medical complex to the movies to I'm sure you guys know the music and the frequencies that they're using. It's the warfare is real. And I mean, if there's any call to action within this podcast, let it be that. If you are drawn to the light, if that's the side that you're trying to fight for, because again, being modest and saying that I believe something, this is just what I believe. I can't prove it, but boy, do I believe that there's a war happening, and boy, do I believe there are sides. If you align with the side of light, this is a call to action to realize that the dark is taking it very seriously. And there are tools out there outside of firearms and Armageddon prepping. As much as I do believe in being prepared, I think God calls us to prepare. We have tools at our disposal to fight this that are far more powerful than anything material that we're aware of.
Amen. I couldn't agree with that. And it sounds like a great wrapping up point for this week's episode. Yeah, I mean, to quote Ephesians, our powers or our fight is not with fleshly, or now I'm paraphrasing here, so apologies for that. But our war basically is a spiritual war. It's not against the principalities and powers of this world, and that's what we really have to understand. And I'll just have my parting thought is, along with everything you said, Michael, one of our biggest powers is consent, and that's what they're always trying to take away from us in some way, to say that it's okay to mutilate yourself or mutilate others or infringe on people or take their rights away, whatever it is. We consent to that in some way, whether implicit or explicit.
Amen.
Yeah, I think Michael summed everything up so well that we don't need to add to that. It's rare that we have a guest that can give us our parting words and give us a call to action. So you've been an awesome guest, Michael. It's been wonderful having you, and I really look forward to staying in touch and learning more about the journey you're on, because you're in a unique position. You haven't fallen for the black pill or the certainty that people run into or end up taking that position, or going into like a looking for a solution in something in a worldly material way, or from a political party or a certain voice out there. So that's rare, and it's definitely you're way ahead of where I was when I started learning about this stuff. So kudos to you for that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to come on and talk to you guys. And I pray that the Lord be with you and give you strength in this journey.
I appreciate that. And of course, we definitely will want to have you back at some point in the future. And maybe you can even twist your wife's arm to come be part of the conversation
Yeah.
She's a ton of fun. I look forward to seeing her again, if not before Confluence, at Confluence, but maybe we can convince her to make this a 4-way conversation and just build on what we did here today.
Awesome. All right. Love you guys.
The love is all around, Michael. We appreciate the time you
Absolutely.
spent with us, and to our listeners, stay tuned. We've got a lot more good stuff heading your way. Michael, thanks again. Until the next time.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.